I'm diverting a little bit from what I intended to talk about this morning, so this is not going to be all about Francis, but he's going to be a jumping off point for some of the things that I say today. It's tempting as we talk about and think about and study the life of St. Francis to make him into something other than human. That's what we tend to do. That's what many people have tended to do over the centuries with Jesus, too, to make him something other than human. It's very important that Jesus is understood to be completely human, completely God, yes, but as he was among us, completely human. And Francis, too, was very human, but he was also very focused on Jesus. And that made him a fool in the eyes of many people. Christianity, for many, maybe even most people of 13th century Italy, had become pomp and circumstance. There were priests to be publicly obeyed and honored, prayers to be repeated, and a culture to be preserved that was institutionally entwined with the wealthy merchant and banking classes, and thus the governing families of France and Italy. To turn his back on the status quo of those persons in his community was not seen by them as an act of piety. They looked upon it, most of them, as an act of insanity. The wealth of his own family had been easy for him as a youth to succumb to enjoy, to flaunt. His position in life was assured, as it still is in all class-driven, class-worshipping societies. But on the way to the rest of his story, Francis was interrupted. Much like the Apostle Paul had been on during his Christian persecuting way of life, Francis had a vision. It was a vision of the truth, the way, and of life. "Rebuild my church," he heard the voice in the vision say. And he rose from the sickbed where he was recovering from injuries received in battle. He arose from that bed as a new creature. He began his new life by literally hauling rocks to rebuild the chapel at Assisi. He read the Gospels intensely now, not as an act of study, but as a participant in the revelations of Jesus almost 1,200 years before Francis. He wanted to emulate the Christ, to be like him in every possible way, as closely as possible. That focus, that tunnel vision toward Christ, made him, in the eyes of many, what Paul had earlier described himself as, a fool for Christ. And that focus led him from rebuilding the chapel at Assisi to rebuilding the spiritual church, the kingdom of heaven on earth, as Jesus described it. This was not a kingdom like the kingdoms of the royal families of Europe, who had governed for centuries. This was not a kingdom of the way things have always been. The kingdom of heaven was a way of life which was always beginning right now. Here, where Francis was for every moment of his life. Early on, he married Lady Poverty. He did that because Jesus, he read, didn't have a home to call his own or even a pillow to lie on, and owned only the robe which he wore. Francis would live like that too, he determined, and then he did. His former friends, sons of wealthy merchants, turned on him. He was taunted, sometimes beaten, shunned by them and others who didn't know what to make of this young man who willingly, foolishly, stepped from the pedestals of high society and into the gutters, the byways, the dirt and hunger of the least, the last, and the lost. But here and there, others, through Francis, saw the same vision. And here and there sometimes, but with increasing frequency as the years passed, others joined with him. Francis had found the words of Jesus to be words of life, real life, life abundant. And that meant he lived penniless, but serenely. He would give away his cloaks and mantles often to those in need, but his heart was always warm. He never had children. Yet tens, then hundreds, then thousands, now millions refer to Francis and his namesakes in time as Father. Why? Always ask why. Never stop asking why until you get an answer. And you'll know it's the right answer because the right answer will always lead to more and even bigger questions. That's just a little editorial on my part. Why did Francis succeed in creating a movement within his city, his church, and now the world? My answer, he kept it simple. His life was about Jesus Christ. The Apostle Paul had written this, now recorded in the book of Acts, about 20 years after the crucifixion of Jesus. He wrote to one of the communities around the Mediterranean where he visited and had begun a fellowship. The chances are excellent that he wrote these words from one of the many jails that he would end up in. It's found in Acts 20, verses 20 through 35. And now I know that none of you, among whom I have gone about proclaiming the kingdom, will ever see my face again. Therefore I declare to you this day that I am not responsible for the blood of any of you. For I did not shrink from declaring to you the whole purpose of God. Now he's saying that his job was finished. He said all that he could say. Keep watch now over yourselves and over all of the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers, to shepherd the church of God that he obtained with the blood of his own Son. I know that after I have gone, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Some even from your own group will come distorting the truth in order to entice the disciples to follow them. Therefore, be alert, remembering that for 3 years I did not cease night or day to warn everyone with tears. And now I commend to you God and to the message of his grace, a message that is able to build you up and to give you the inheritance among all who are sanctified. I coveted no one's silver or gold or clothing. You know for yourselves that I worked with my own hands to support myself and my companions. In all of this I have given you an example that by such work we must support the weak, remembering the words of the Lord Jesus, for he himself said, it is more blessed to give than to receive. That line, I know that after I've gone, savage wolves will come in among you, not sparing the flock. Some, even from your own group, will distort the truth in order to entice the disciples to follow them. Paul knew early on the fragility of human intentions. Indeed, Christ had witnessed it too. On the Sunday before his Friday crucifixion, Jesus had been greeted by crowds on the way into Jerusalem for Passover. By Friday, those crowds were rejecting him as a weakling, a failure, in giving him over to the Roman executioners. Paul knew that the message of Christ, the stories about Jesus, and remember, there were no Gospels when Paul was preaching, no New Testament at that time. Paul knew those stories, those spoken, oral stories, were subject to being hijacked by those who worshiped the status quo or who selfishly sought to establish their own forms of kingdoms on earth. But Paul did what he could. He traveled, he preached, he taught, and he stayed focused. And that's what Francis did too, fully aware that there would be always wolves in the woods waiting to pounce, and distorters of the truth always ready to twist the words of Jesus into their own personal weapons of power. But as Jesus did as nails were driven, as Paul did as the executioner's axe fell, so did Francis. He forgave his persecutors, his doubters, and moved on toward the lepers, toward the victims of poverty, toward even the birds and the animals when there was no one else to listen to him. He stayed close, behind and beside his Christ, come what may. As I've been thinking about and reading so much about Francis over the last 6 weeks, I've been particularly moved by what has been happening on our country's southern borders over the last 6 months. And I start what I'm going to say from this premise. The moment Jesus diverted his journey to Galilee through the spiritually illegal area of Samaria, he showed us forever about the regard he held for humanly contrived boundaries. He broke Jewish law all the time whenever it got in the way of the love of his Father, which is what he wanted to reveal. And spiritual legalities for the powerful Pharisees and the Roman puppet king of the Jews, Herod, were far more stringently applied than even Roman civil law. Jesus stepped across the line with regularity. Francis showed his regard for geographical boundaries when in 1219, during the Fifth Crusade, he left the Christian soldiers' camp, where they were besieging the Muslim stronghold of Damietta in Egypt, to go to the enemy, to try and to convert their military leader and sultan, Muhammad al-Kamil. He took one assistant with him in what the other crusaders thought would be the very last trip that Francis would ever take. Jesus went where he was not supposed to go. Francis went where he was not supposed to go. Today, we have thousands of Central American children and minors, many as young as 5 and 6, many teens and preteens, and some as old as 20, crossing the borders into the southwest United States. The majority are from Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, 3 countries with the highest murder rates in the world, and each in an economic stranglehold by criminal cartels. Poverty is rampant. The violence is born of too many people seeking to control too few dollars. These are not backwoods people. This rise in crime is fairly recent and born largely by the insatiable need to the north for drugs, and more drugs. The people of these 3 countries are highly literate and enjoy inoculation rates against various diseases that are even higher than those in the United States. Parents are desperate that their children have the kind of life they have given up ever having again. I've heard it asked often, how could any parents ever give up their children and send them by themselves at great expense to America with no guarantee that they would ever see those children again? And it's a good question. Because the obvious answer, the easy answer seized upon by so many is that these must be selfish, uncaring people to do such a thing to their children. The more difficult answer is one which most of us barely have the courage to contemplate, namely, what kind of horrifying desperation must these parents be facing, and how powerful is their love that they would take this chance with their children's and their own lives. In the 1700s, facing poverty in England, thousands of parents signed indentured servitude contracts with contractors who supplied child labor to American colonists. In the late 1800s, orphan trains, many filled with the children of poor Irish and Italian immigrants to America, were sent west in the parents' hope that children would be adopted or cared for in ways their parents in eastern urban areas had given up ever being able to do. Most recently, Jewish people all over Europe once the Nazis' final solution became known, sent their children to places where it was rumored there might be help for them. None of the parents in England, the eastern United States, or in Nazi-occupied Europe loved their children an iota less than we love our children. And that is true of these Central American parents as well. None of us, thank God, have ever been called upon to summon the kind of love for our children, which could mean we will never see them again. I really do try to think about these kinds of major problems facing us as a nation and as a world in terms loosely based around what would Jesus do. Of course, whatever answers I come up with are only best guesses by me. But I can get closer when I add on to that, what would Francis do? And I can get a whole lot closer when I remember again a story I've told you about here before. A place and an episode in history that has been basic to my foundations of following Christ. And that's the story of Les Chambon in France in the war years of 1940 to 1945. Les Chambon is a small village, kind of nestled beside a river, Sur-Lignon, between two large banks of hills, old dead volcanoes, in fact. The story I tell you today about it is an abbreviated one, but the parallels are too dramatic between what happened in this small south-central French town nestled in the foothills of the Swiss Alps, and what is happening on our own Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California borders. France under President Pétain capitulated to and signed a memorandum of agreement with the German Third Reich in 1940. One of the primary reasons he signed, and which his cabinet went along with the signing of that memorandum, was fear. Fear that France might be invaded like Poland had been. Fear that the millennial-old French culture would be eradicated by the new way of German life if they out-and-out conquered French people militarily. The Germans promised tolerance and cooperation, and the French government acquiesced. Fear is the second greatest motivator. Love is the first greatest, but when fear is rampant, when fear is being stoked by persons in authority, even good people can be twisted into whatever shapes the loudest, most fear-mongering voices want them to be twisted into. In the summer of 1942, the seizure of Jewish property and the gathering up of Jewish people in Paris began. In Les Chambon, 6 months later, on a cold and snowy night in December of 1942, at the parsonage home of Protestant minister André Trocme and his wife Magda, there was a late-night knock on the door. Since the Paris roundup of Jews had begun that summer, Trocme had begun preaching and teaching about the need for caring for the stranger, the refugee who might seek shelter in Les Chambon. And now he was about to be called to turn his words into action. Remember when Francis heard those words, "Rebuild my church"? André and Magda Trocme, when they answered the door, found a thin, inadequately dressed young Jewish woman who said in equally prophetic and life-changing words, "May I come in?" There were many reasons, so many reasons they could have refused, and we've heard them all lately in different languages, but under not so very different circumstances. The Trocmes had 5 children. They could hardly afford to take somebody into their home where they had no spare beds. They would be breaking the law, the French law of the surrendered Vichy government, but also the harsher laws of the Third Reich, where the hiding of Jews could be and often did lead to death. Maybe the young woman was sick and she would infect the children. Maybe she was a spy sent by the government to see if Trachman was really willing to act on the words he spoke from the pulpit. There were lots of reasons to close the door when the woman asked, "May I come in?" But Magda answered first, "Of course you may come in." Over the next 3 years, almost 5,000 Jewish refugees, most of them children, including toddlers, carried by older brothers and sisters, would hear those words in some form. Of course you may come in. Through Trachma and the Protestant temple, the whole village of Les Chambon was enlisted in the great work, the great single-focused work of saving Jewish lives, of giving shelter and hope to refugees who had run out of both. The whole village, everyone, focused on that one thing, loving God and loving your neighbor. And the ways they carried that out are many and inspiring, but I'll just share a few this morning. The people of Les Chambon were not wealthy, but they found ways to feed all of their guests. Their gardens got bigger. They went hunting and fishing more often, and they all ate much less and shared quickly. The German occupation armies made regular and unscheduled patrols of the area. And it was the local Boy Scouts who were recruited to watch out for them. 12 to 18-year-old boys in Les Chambon, who were recruited to watch out for them in the hills above Les Chambon, where for 3 years there was a Boy Scout camping trip happening. When Nazi jeeps or trucks were spotted, the scouts would blow whistles, which was a signal for all Jews to hide right now, and most would head deep into the surrounding woods. When the patrols had left the area, the church's choir would gather and go outside and sing hymns to the hills that it was safe again. Most of the Jewish children were eventually smuggled out of Les Chambon to Red Cross or underground Quaker aid stations where they would be sent to a country of safety or neutrality, like Switzerland or later England or the United States. But they needed papers to do that, and the town's librarian became a forger, a masterful and productive one, who produced thousands of birth certificates and visas for the children, giving them new, non-Jewish names. Humble farmers risked their lives to hide babies in haymows. Store owners emptied their shelves of shoes and blankets, and every new mother nursed her own child in the toddler of a stranger. Were they afraid? Yes, 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 every day, every hour. But they were more in love with their God and with their neighbor. And unlike the noble and courageous resistance fighters of France, the people of Les Chambon did all of their noble and courageous work non-violently, even caring at times for sick and injured German soldiers in the same homes where Jewish children were being hidden. What would Jesus do? What would Francis do? There's the answer, I think. They would love God and love their neighbor. No excuses, no nationalistic idols, no religious or cultural rules. In 2004, a small park was dedicated in Jerusalem to the righteous Gentiles of Les Chambon. On the plaque there, Les Chambon is called a place where goodness happened. May that be how this generation in this place is one day remembered as a place where goodness happened. Amen.